Hello everyone, this is Neon. Welcome to Impromptu English with Neon, and today we are going to have a reading out loud session, which is a reading aloud session, which is that I will be reading a fictional piece, which is actually my own novel. Yes, I have written a novel actually before I even started this channel. I will of course be making a dedicated video on it, inshallah, one day, but I have to make some time for it because I want it to be very, very top notch. I want to make it special. I just don't want to half-hazard it, right? But today I am going to be reading one part. So this is in chapter 3 of my novel, which is titled To Speak or Not to Speak. So a little bit of preface before I begin. So a little background information, not on the novel, but on the importance of reading out loud, why it matters, how you should do it. So of course, reading out loud. This means that we read something aloud. Read something loudly, not just in our minds, not just by muttering it, or not even by just not moving our mouths at all while we read something. Or it is not when we read it in our mind, but it is when we actually utter the words that we are reading. So it has a ton of benefits. If you just Google the importance of reading out loud, you will see that it is not just a reading skill, but it also facilitates your speaking skills, especially if you are a commercial reader, like if you're a journalist, if you're a script reader, or if you're any type of narrator. Then reading out loud is of course very, very important. You need to know where to pause, you need to know which words to stress or emphasize, you need to know where to actually stop to take a breath, because you should not just pause at any moment. Let me tell you through some examples. For example, in this sentence, the first sentence of this chapter, eyebrows, you can also pronounce it as eyebrows, but it's the quote-unquote proper way, the standard way to pronounce it is eyebrows. So if you read like this, eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms crossed across the chest as if to stifle movement, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience, I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. So of course this is a very bad way to read something aloud, or even to read something even in your head if you do not pronounce it, because when you read something with taking random pauses, then it is very, very difficult for the listener. Or maybe if it's something like you are speaking it, you're reading a script and then talking to someone, or maybe if that scenario ever arises where you speak but you do not take appropriate pauses, then your listener, the other people who are listening to you, or maybe you even yourself, if when you read something you will not probably understand him or her, or even yourself if you're reading the one yourself. So what would be a better way to read? Eyebrows not only raised but twitching. So since a comma here, you should take a brief pause, not 5-6 seconds pause. It should be something like a 1 second pause, or even at least a half second pause, right? 1 or 2 seconds, I think that is more appropriate. Again, eyebrows not only raised, so it's like this, raised but twitching. So that means to shake or to move up and down. Eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms crossed across the chest as if to stifle movement. So the word stifle means to stop, right? To prevent, to minimize. And yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience, I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. So notice where I paused. So I paused whenever there was a comma. Of course, after a full stop I will pause, but since this para only has one sentence, so there is no scope to pause after a full stop yet, not in this paragraph yet. So eyebrows not only raised but twitching, so there is a pause here, and there is also an optional brief pause before but. You can read like this, eyebrows not only raised but twitching. Before the word but, you can take a brief pause, like a half second pause, and then after twitching you can take a 1 or 2 second pause. All right, arms crossed as across the chest, then you can also take a brief pause. as if to stifle movement, then another bigger pause, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience. You can also take another breath after you pronounce on the floor in impatience. Okay, and if you want to take too many pauses, even more pauses than I am taking, then you can actually pause here, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience. So feet, there is a pause, tapping on the floor, there is another pause, and after in impatience there is a longer pause after impatience, because there is a punctuation, there is a comma, so it signals that you should take a pause. So it's not like you have to always take pauses after a comma. For example, in the word, if you have a sentence like I like apples, comma, bananas, comma, and oranges. Okay, if this is the sentence, you do not have to speak it, or you don't have to read it like I like apples, bananas, and oranges. So you can actually do this, but it's maybe too much. You don't have to pause. Like you can say I like apples, bananas, and oranges. Okay, but notice this, even when I am speaking aloud, when I'm reading this sentence aloud, there is still a signal that there is a comma. How? Through my intonation. So listen again. I like apples, bananas, and oranges. Apples, bananas, and oranges. So even though I am reading this sentence aloud in one breath, I'm not taking I like apples, bananas, and oranges. So I'm not doing this, but I'm just reading it like this. I like apples, bananas, and oranges. So even when I speak it, when I read it very slowly like this, but not too slowly, like taking 2 or 3 pauses, 2 or 3 breaths, even though I do not do that, still there is, you can very much understand by listening to me that there is a comma here, because there are different items. There are 3 items: apples, bananas, and oranges, right? So how do I do this? I signal this through my intonation. So what is intonation? So if you have read poetry or introduction to poetry, if you have done that course, or if you just know, if you have studied poetry, you will know that the British especially speak in, at least the British poetry, most of them, the standard is iambic pentameter. So the first word is stressed, the next word is unstressed. Alright, so it's like father. The word father has 2 syllables. You can say fa plus der. So it's father. The fa is a louder intonation. It is stressed. But the next syllable, der, it is not stressed. So let me give you another example. Children. So what do you think, which syllable is stressed in children? We can divide the word children into chill plus dren. So the first, it's not children, so it's children, right? Children. So the first syllable, that is stressed. Okay, so in English, it's not always the case that the first syllable is always stressed. It's not always the case. For example, even look here, bananas. So it's not bananas, or it's not bananas. So it's bananas, right? Especially in the British and the American pronunciation, it's bananas. Some people may just call it as banana or banana without any stress, but the quote-unquote standard way to pronounce it is bananas. So the middle na, that is stressed. Okay, so let me read it with proper intonation, quote-unquote proper intonation. You will see that I am focusing on the first syllable of most of these words. I am giving some stress, I am giving some emphasis, and for the next syllable I am not giving that much emphasis. For example, the first word, eyebrows, so I'm focusing on eye, not brows. Alright, so, and also every noun and every verb that will almost always be stressed, those will be stressed. But prepositions and articles, so those will most probably in 99% of the cases not be stressed. For example, but, we will not say eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms crossed across the chest as if to stifle movement. So we will not be reading out loud by stressing on the prepositions and the articles. There will be some exceptions if the pronoun, or if the the preposition or the article is very important. So for example, if I say I'm talking about the apple. So I'm focusing on the word the, like that apple, the apple that I was talking about. So the preposition can also be important. For example, it's on the table, not under. Right? I'm saying that it is on the table, not under the table. So in some cases, the prepositions and the articles, they may be stressed, but in 99% of the cases, you can say they are not normally stressed. All right. So I think I will start reading, because by listening to me read, I think you will get a lot more about how to actually read. So of course, this is an unscripted video, this is an impromptu English with Neon video, so there will probably be some mistakes, but try to take the positives from my reading out loud session. So a little bit more preface before I start. So whenever you see any word which is italicized, or which is in italics, or which is like bent in this way, okay, so this way, that means that it has to be stressed. And also, if you see any word which is, for example, written in caps, in capital letters, for example, come here, I'm saying like come here, come here. So the word here, or don't go, so that of course signals, or that of course represents that someone is screaming, or someone is saying something very loudly. So of course you will also have to put some stress on those words, and extra stress, not only normally what the stress that we give to verbs and nouns, but even more for those words or phrases. And also, if there is any question or interrogative sentence or even exclamatory sentence, then the intonation will be high when you end the sentence. For example, is there any question here? Let me see. So if there is any question, for example, here there is an exclamatory phrase, no kidding. So it has to be read as like this. Sometimes more, no kidding, like no kidding. The intonation has to be high when you end that phrase, when you end reading that phrase. It's not something like sometimes more, no kidding, no kidding. It's not like no kidding. It has to be no kidding. All right. And if there is any question, so I think there's a question. Yeah, how can you hang around with him? So it's like, how can you hang around with him? So it's a high intonation, not how can you hang around with him, not like this, with him, not like this, but rather with him. So it's a question, right? In any interrogative sentence or any exclamatory sentence, the intonation should be high when you end the sentence. All right. Okay, and also at the end of the paragraph, your intonation should lower. Okay, so the best example I can give is when we recite any surahs out loud, or even when we recite it in our minds, when we read a surah, recite a surah in our prayers, or at other times, at the end of the surah, we say it in such a way as if we know that other people may also know. It's a signal that we are ending the surah. The surah has just ended, right? So in English as well, when you read the end of a paragraph, when you read the ending sentence, so you should do it like this: by speaking up and asking questions or adding input into the discussion, not into the discussion, right? So you should end it with a lowering of your intonation. You should end it with a low intonation. Okay, so let's read. So let me read the first para twice, by once the first time by reading it very slowly, so you can understand the up and down of intonation. It's not a flat intonation. It's not something like eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms across the chest as if to stifle movement, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience. I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. So it should not be like this. It's not a good example of reading out loud. Rather, it should be something like this: eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms crossed across the chest as if to stifle movement, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience. I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. Alright, so since I spoke very slow, since I spoke it by breaking down the syllables, so it may have sounded a bit unnatural, but I did it so that you can understand which parts of the sentences, which parts of the words, even which syllables to emphasize and which syllables to not. So let me read it normally this time. Eyebrows not only raised but twitching, arms crossed across the chest as if to stifle movement, and yet feet tapping on the floor in impatience. I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. Okay, so also notice that where I paused here, but twitching, I paused after every comma. And also sometimes I took some minor pauses after a chunk of information. So after a phrase, for example, I could have paused in and yet feet tapping on the floor. Micro pause. In impatience, then a bigger pause. I weighed the pros and cons. Micro pause. A short, very, very short pause, and then of speaking up. Then a longer pause. Alright, so you can actually pause, you can take breaths after you end a phrase, but not randomly. You cannot pause something like I weighed the pros and cons of speaking up. You cannot do this. If you do this, then it will be not understandable at all, not even for yourself when you read something. So you should read in chunks. What are chunks? Chunks are specific series of units of words which go together, like phrases, clauses. They are chunks. If you read, for example, feet tapping on the floor, so this part, or tapping on the floor, if you do not read it in one breath, if you read it something like tapping on the floor, then it will not sound good and will not be meaningful. You should also not read it like tapping on the floor, but you should read it as tapping on the floor. You should read it in one breath, in one tempo. Alright. I have spoken up twice in the span of 40 minutes. I reasoned with myself. There's still that much time left before class ends. If I speak now, this makes it the third time. And for the rest of the class, if I only speak up one more time, will that be too much? So notice how my intonation was when I was reading this part. So my intonation was high at the end of this because there is a question mark. Otherwise my intonation would be low, because at the end of a paragraph it should almost always be low. But if there is a question mark, if there is an exclamation mark, then of course it should be high. Yes, I believe that will be a lot. Speaking up in class a total of 4 times would probably be a tad too much. So notice that I paused after 4 times. And so I remained silent while the teacher carried on to another topic. There was a pause here. Recently, I have noticed that some people take issue with me disrupting the class flow by speaking up and asking questions or adding input into the discussion. So notice that my tempo was lower. My intonation was lower as I finished reading the paragraph. I didn't tell you this, Minthan recently told me, but Tasnuva was once like, how can you hang around with him? He's too much. I think, Iman, some people don't take it well that you know so much. Don't be sad. Yasin had tried to cheer me up. They don't know you personally. That's why they're jealous. And also notice that there is a verb, right? There is a modal auxiliary verb missing in this sentence, in this dialogue. That's why they are jealous. It should be they are jealous, right? But it was intentional because I wanted to portray Yasin as someone who has some grammatical issues. Alright, so that is intentional. Even before, so also notice where I put my stress, okay? So constantly notice this. Even before I got to know about this, I was self-conscious about the matter. It was never ever my intention to disrupt the class and throw off the lecture. Rather, I want to add in my ever-wondering thoughts about the lecture, which I believe should only enhance it for us students. In other words, so whenever there is a comma, there should always be a pause. In other words, aside from clarifying my own doubts, I often added in examples to make the topic even more understandable to the rest of the class. So let me skip around for a bit. Let me read from here actually. Okay. And so I have devised a formula so as not to come across as a show-off and simultaneously also not disappoint the teacher and make him or her awkward at minimal student participation. Here are the ground rules. Number 1, never ever speak up in class more than 5 times maximum. So of course that should be emphasized because it's in italics. If you can't resist the urge to add something to the class discussion, and for doing so you have to cut the teacher off in mid-sentence, do so only once every 2 classes. Number 3, feel free to respond when called by name and asked to do so. Number 4, if the teacher says, quote unquote, anyone but Iman, please answer, then refrain from speaking up for the rest of the class. So the whole thing is in italics, so you have to emphasize this part. Number 5, if the question is super basic, like, quote unquote, what is the full form of CLT, then stay silent. Focus on the hard questions to step in and take the floor. Otherwise, the floor is lava. Treat carefully. Okay, so see how the intonation was. The floor is lava. Treat carefully. Right? The intonation is high. Indeed, the conversational floor in the classroom is lava, and the classroom a volcano waiting to erupt at me with judgments and negative impressions. Sometimes the lava bubbles are too big and numerous, and it's judicious for me not to speak up at all, as when the teacher does not pause in between topics to ask students if they understood or ask for their opinion, and rather keeps on talking and giving no scope for one to chime in without interrupting him in mid-sentence. And sometimes there are no bubbles, but rather a safe and smooth platform manifests to make way for me to walk on, like in those classes where the teacher constantly asks the students to join in. For the latter scenario, the manifested footpath may break away if the teacher has not created a friendly environment, but is instead pressurizing students to jump in the lava and get sinked. But another part of me feels that people shouldn't approach life tormented by such paranoia. Sometimes it's okay to make a fool of yourself and get laughed at by your peers, and it's not like I let these thoughts affect me all that much. Well, if you don't count the ground rules I made for class participation and all. And of course, look at this ellipsis, that's this ... So whenever you see this, if you're reading out loud, then drop the intonation down to as low as possible. So again, let me read this. Well, if you don't count the ground rules I made for class participation and all. So it's like your voice is trailing off, right? Your intonation has to be very low at this point. Alright, so I'd like to end the reading out loud session, but I'd like to say some thoughts, express some of my thoughts that I had while reading. So I had some impromptu thoughts that I think I should let you know before closing off this video. So I think that many of you may be thinking that, no sir, I do not have an American English accent, or I do not have a British English accent, or even an Australian or a New Zealand English accent, Canadian English accent. So how can I read out loud well and get very good marks, or how can I do it for my other purposes beyond studies? How can I do that if I do not have good pronunciation or a good accent? So the thing is, an accent, it doesn't actually matter in most cases. So it shouldn't matter. Nobody should actually humiliate you for having a quote-unquote Bangladeshi English accent, or maybe another quote-unquote non-standard accent. Okay, for example, many people actually make fun when people call, for example, the word zoo as Jew, right? Many Bangladeshi people who actually had their education in a Bangla medium school, especially from a rural area, they have difficulty pronouncing some words because they have not pronounced these words from when they were young. So actually, since I have done my research in applied linguistics and ELT in second language acquisition, I know that research actually says that to change your accent is almost impossible after you have become a teenager. And of course, most of us are adults, or at least late teenagers, probably most of my audience. So most of you, if not all of you, will have almost like an impossible task to change your accent today. It's not completely impossible, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to change your accent and always say zoo instead of Jew. And also there are some other words. For example, some people even pronounce like juice, the word juice, as jush, like jush cow, right? So that some people may find it very laughable or humiliating if someone speaks it in such a manner, but you shouldn't feel this way, because in any like international exam, or for example the IELTS, the TOEFL, they will not penalize you for having an accent, as long as it is understandable, as long as it is comprehensible. Do not worry about this. However, you should know proper pronunciation. Okay, so the concept of pronunciation is actually slightly different from the concept of accent. So pronunciation and accent are very much related. The way you pronounce most things which are characteristic of your geographical area, which are characteristic of your social class, that can be broadly classified as an accent. But pronunciation is on the word level. We pronounce every single word, every single syllable differently, right? Okay, so very easy example. If you like, I follow the American English accent, and even in the British English accent, which is compared to American, British English accent is also a quote-unquote standard variety of English. So people with a British English accent say, and also an American English accent, say the word play as play, play. So it's like play, but most Bangladeshi people I know, they say play, not play, they play. And it's also the same, it's very similar to game, so they say game, right? GEM, as if it's game, not game. And also they say they do not use aspirated vowels, they do not pronounce, like for example P as P, they say P. Like they say the word pen, not pen, right? So American people, British people, they pronounce it as pen, PHEN, not pen, right? And also T, like TEA, T, not T, it is T. In the Bangla language, it's like ta, the letter ta instead of ta. But since the Bangla alphabet has both these letters, so there is a differentiation. But in English, in quote unquote standard English, there is no T sound, there is a T sound. Alright, so I'm not saying that the word T is wrong, so because it is not actually wrong, this is a matter of accent. So if you pronounce T as T, that is alright. However, you cannot mispronounce things as they should be pronounced. For example, very easy examples are, so if you pronounce pressurizing as pressurizing, that is okay. No, instead of pressurizing, if you say pressurizing, it's okay. But if you say pressurizing, instead of sha, you pronounce it as sa, then it is wrong. It is a wrong pronunciation. You cannot say pressurizing. You have to say pressurizing or pressurizing. It has to be sha. The pronunciation of this part, it has to be sha, not sa. Very easy examples. You have to pronounce it as another, not another or another, right? And you can pronounce it as the quote unquote standard way to pronounce this is fool. It's like fool. But if you just pronounce it as full, like full, like FULL, full, that is okay. That is a matter of accent. But you cannot pronounce it as something like fall or fool. You cannot do a very fundamentally different pronunciation. Okay, so the word cough can be pronounced as cough, right? So the word cough, it can be pronounced as cough. Many people pronounce it as cough, even though the quote unquote standard way to pronounce it is cough. However, if you pronounce it as cow or cough, then it is wrong. Some other examples, some difficult examples, because I don't think that many people actually mispronounce those words. So paranoia, right? It is paranoia. So you can pronounce it as paranoia or paranoia, but you cannot say it as paranoia. Paranoia. You cannot pronounce it as like this. Or diarrhea, you can pronounce it as diarrhea or simply as diarrhea, but you cannot pronounce it as diarrhea because there is an H in the spelling. Another example, you cannot pronounce honest as honest. That's a wrong pronunciation. Alright, and also this word is singed, alright, not singed, singed, but that is a difficult example. Most of the pronunciation difficulties that I talked about, you do not have to worry about them because They're very easy. There are some words that you should worry about. For example, this word, many people may not actually know how to pronounce it, so it should be trivial, or trivial, all right, not trivial or trivial. Okay, if you say trivial or trivial, that is a cause for penalizing marks. So if you say trivial, you will lose marks in a reading out loud assignment, in a reading out loud class test. Alright, so I think I will be I will be ending this video today right now. So please comment whatever, if you have got any questions in your mind after this reading out loud session. I would have liked to read a lot more, but already this video is very long. I wanted to read most of this chapter so that you would get a lot more modeling from my reading. But do sound off your opinions in the comments, and do tell me if you'd like me to do more reading out loud sessions, more reading out loud videos. So there was a lot that I already talked about in this video, but there are a lot more things that I would like to touch on. Not only more reading of my novel, but also more importances, more significances of reading out loud. So this is not only related to reading, but also to speaking. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed and hope you stay with me on my journey to become more fluent in English.